So I guess you know who we are. You've seen a lot of us already. Do you want to say anything else about who you are?
I don't want to say anything about who I am. Deborah and I, we had a bet with Trish. We're like, people are tired of us. No one's going to come and to our last session. So we appreciate you engaging. And I think the other thing is I had a really lovely exchange with Dana, and I were in the hallway. And I think one of the things, because we knew we were doing these 3 sessions, the kind of punchline to the things that we've been talking about are in this session, so you're gonna get the benefit of that. So the full connection, I think, to the essential practices and what we've been arguing around these storylines and what ends up here, I think hasn't been fully clear, but I think by the end of our session today, you're really gonna feel it. And then if anyone wants to get up and tell the whole group what you learned, I would, we'd love that.
Okay, so does this work? Yeah. So there's a little thing to get started. Here are 3 artifacts or quotes. And since we're going to be looking across the 20th century and into this century to see what's been going on with quote-unquote reform in mathematics education, take a couple minutes at your table and try to decide, at least if you can't figure out what year each of these is from, roughly what decade you think they're from. We're gonna have to use mics again, Macy, probably. Does anybody want to venture a hypothesis about any one of these, or maybe you know for sure? Okay. I think we are going to still have to use the mics in here. I'm sorry.
I really didn't need a microphone. So I hypothesize that the first picture is from 1984. The second one is probably from 1920s. The middle one I'm not quite sure about.
What made you think the one on the right was from 1920?
It sounds like a square deal statement.
Okay. Other hypotheses or certainties?
Well, the middle one I'm saying is 90s just because of the math saying it was 20 years ago. And the one on the left, I'm going to say 1986 just because the computer's probably from about 82, and by the time the book got published, it should be about 4 years old.
Anyone else? So we can narrow it down a little bit. Open Court is a math curriculum that was published in the 80s. So we've had a couple of guesses about the 80s. It was one of the curricula that was being used in California around the first time. There were a lot of battles over math curriculum in California, but it was also a nationwide curriculum. It was developed by a mathematician named Stephen Willoughby. So that's also, we're going to pick up some things that repeat themselves often, but that's real math. I think the looking at the computer is interesting to see what the clue. The middle one, so it's seeing Lamar Alexander gives a little bit away. So it's around the early 90s, that quote from a newspaper article. But the one on the right, we don't really quite have fixed down yet.
I want to say it's early 1900s.
So early 1900s is kind of what you guessed too, right? It's actually later than that. It's a quote from the mathematics teacher, the NCTM journal that was called The Mathematics Teacher in 1953. So part of what we're going to try to look at today is what's been changing, what hasn't been changing, and some other questions related to this. So we just thought we'd start with that. The basic problem for the session that we've tried each day to say, what's the problem we're working on? So the one today is, across decades, and we're using air quotes around the word reform, because there is something about using that word over and over again. It's not so clear, what's exactly being done and what the word reform means. So we're treating it with a bit of skepticism, or at least not assuming what it means or what it does, but we're looking to see across decades of this, which there have been many, depending on which decade you started your career in, which we will have to identify at some point today, what has actually been changing and what has not. So the next thing we wanted to ask you to talk about and then share out a little bit is, why did you choose this session? There were a great menu of options for this time block. So what was it about this, which will probably help us know a little bit more about you and what you're hoping to learn or what you've been thinking about that you're bringing to this? Because we're going to be doing quite a bit of investigation together today with Artifact. So talk to each other a little, like, why did you pick it? And then maybe we'll share out a little bit. Why did we pick this session? No. We could say why we picked it, why we decided to do it too.
Just like model what. Okay. I'm going to try to model what a share might be. My name is MAISA Golson. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan. The reason that I chose this session to design it is because I'm really concerned about how we are talking about mathematics education right now. And I feel like we need to have a more robust and kind of historical understanding to make sense of the current political moment and how mathematics is being framed and how people are talking about how it should be taught. So that's why I'm here. And we made eye contact, so that's the danger.
Did I do that? I was just looking at you because you're the speaker. Oh. I was just being a good participant. So I think a lot about being an interrupter, and for me, it's important to be here. If I understand more, I think I can help others understand more, and we can push on change by interrupting our legacy practices that we don't even know where we got them from. Oh, yeah, my name is Jennifer Curtis. I'm a math consultant in Oakland.
I didn't quite hear you. Could you say that again?
I'm a math consultant in Oakland.
It helps us also to know a little bit more about who you all are, because it helps us when we design these sessions to have a little better sense.
So if
We
I
don't
make eye
always know
contact with
exactly.
someone, I can make them talk. Don't give me a microphone. That's dangerous. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Kelly Shepard. I'm with the Jackson County ISD, and I'm here because we kind of talked at our table too. If you can't understand where you've been, you have the fear of possibly repeating things that never worked in the past. And so really understanding where we've come from so we can move forward. And in my role, I chose the session in particular because I deal a lot with superintendents and helping to foster change. And so much like what was said earlier, having those foundational understandings so that we can really push knowledge, push thinking, and really enact some change.
Oh, dang. That was quick. Okay. I'm from Washington ISD, Jennifer Banks, and I was sharing, chose this session because I'm interested in the whole storyline. Like, what storylines have we been replaying over and over again around mathematics that are holding us back? And so I'm just interested in from that perspective.
Good morning. I'm Sharon Ramsey from Wayne Risa, and I think my purpose or why I chose this session is similar to what Jennifer just mentioned, but just really thinking, just curiosity about how education has shifted or how much it has shifted across history. I mean, I think about classrooms now and how much has really changed. So I'm just interested in that, my curiosity.
Good morning. I'm Yarisha Johnson. I'm also with Oakland. Similarly to what's already been shared, I'm interested in the idea of reform. How has that changed historically about mathematics? What did people believe previously about what it would take to reform our mathematics practices versus what we believe now? We're popcorning people.
Good morning. My reason for being here is a little more personal, less educational. I really enjoy Dr. Ball's sessions just in general. And every time that I'm in her sessions, I learn not only something new, but I think about things differently. And I leave with a different perspective than I walked in the room with. So I came to this session hoping to learn something new and challenge whatever thinking I already have.
Now I feel really like...
No pressure, no pressure.
I'm Jennifer Brickerell from Ingham ISD, and I'm going to piggyback off of, I didn't catch your name, but so I'm going to piggyback off of what she said around Dr. Ball, because I don't know if any of you were in teacher education classes in like the early 2000s at Michigan State, but we watched videos of Dr. Ball teaching at Spartan Village, and and at that point, they were from several years beforehand. So like we're talking over 20 years ago, maybe. Sorry, Dr. But you were doing these things that we're talking about today and that Dr. Parks is talking about and Dr. Golston is talking. You were doing that so long ago. And so I was just really curious about like what your take on how mathematics reform was happening, back when you were in the classroom, and if it's changed and how, like now that you're at the university level. So
I think I'm going to pop in here and do my thing since my name has now come up twice. One thing Macy and I were talking about earlier is that we both entered education in different decades, obviously, and taught and began our teaching careers in really different places. So, and actually through different academic pathways also, right? Because you were you were doing other things. You were a patent. You should have said more about that. But you didn't come directly into education. I don't think I can say it quite accurately. Could you say? Yeah. Yeah. So you didn't enter directly, and you're in a different part of the country. We obviously have different identities, different ages. And I entered very young as a teacher in East Lansing, Michigan. So just really different histories. And yet from the time we began working together on lots of things, we found so many overlaps and intersections and sometimes arguments that have really, to your point, Kylie, like we learned so much from working together. And this was interesting to work on because we hadn't quite talked about all of these patterns before. And we got really into thinking about what have we both seen given who we are and where we've been. and began to notice things. And we're eager today to actually do more of that work with you, because it's pretty striking, as several of you have said, is like how we keep going around and around, and you'll see. We're really eager to see what you do, and we were really interested in doing it together. This isn't a session either of us wanted at all to do alone. So I'm glad to have you as my partner here, but we're glad to have you also interested in this, because we think we'll learn a lot from you today as well. Did anybody else at this table want to go? So we're passing it out? Okay.
Our table was all equally interested in history. Some of us with math backgrounds, some without. We even have one person with both history and math in his teaching experience. But one of the things that really got me interested is it seems like every generation we complain about kids these days. And you can go back to Socrates and find complaints about kids these days. And we know more about kids than we ever did. We know more about the brain than we ever did. And you can say that every single day. But what are we doing differently about it? Where a lot of our classrooms still might look like ancient Greece. And that might not be a bad thing if we're getting open Socratic dialogue. Like, we still do that, and it's okay. And we don't have to just reinvent everything if some of the stuff is working. But we don't always know what's working.
Everybody voted that I was going to talk. So I'm going to summarize a couple things from our table. So we're all from the MySTEM network. So we are very interested in thinking about systems kind of change. And so if we don't know our history, we're going to be repeating those same things. The other piece is that we have a math action area from that the MySTEM has been convening, and part of our working group is around culturally responsive mathematics and partnering with our Tri-County culturally responsive math folks, thinking about who are we serving in each of these shifts, and thinking about the reform and how do we open more access and equity in that.
Where are you from?
I'm from Huron.
So Huron and Berrien. Okay. Did anybody else hear one?
Diane gave me the microphone. I don't actually need it in a room this small, but
I need it because I can't hear.
you'd be able to hear me. I just wanted to say I'm here for Maisie.
For what? Oh, stop.
We talked, we're here for a lot of the same reasons. We are really interested in the change in mathematics and the change that hasn't happened in mathematics. So, and I did part of my student teaching at Spartan Village too.
You did?
I did. So it means that building no longer exists now, so.
We drove by it yesterday, or Sunday, and I pointed it out. Yeah. The building doesn't exist. The apartments still exist, but the building is gone, yeah. This is where I taught, so I taught. You were a student teacher. What year was that?
99.
99.
We're also talking about, like, we want to change things, but don't you get the kind of awe feeling when someone is connecting to your history and there's continuity? So I think we need to, like, recognize what continuity also does to us emotionally and how it grounds us. So just an observation in terms of our own stories.
And I have been struck, I'm Trish from MAISA, but also from Macomb. But I'm often struck by, I'll call it movements that work to change education or specifically math. But I feel like the work that we are doing is really far from the getting into the classroom. We've spent a lot of time working on literacy, and we really haven't focused on mathematics, yet we keep hearing like we're doing it wrong, we need to change something that I don't think, like several of you have mentioned, like I've been watching Dr. Ball, her videos for years, and trying to implement that myself and try to support educators. And I I'm not seeing change. So we keep working for change, but then there's not change that's been happening.
I feel like everyone said it really well. I'm Amy from West Shore ESD.
Same sentiments here. Teddy Simmons, MAISA.
I'm Amanda Cook from Van Buren ISD, and I looked through the presenter names and just came. Didn't care what this session was titled. I know I would learn a lot and be challenged and be a wiser educator by the end.
I'm just thinking about your comment, Macy, about people's connections. How many people in here have had their whole professional career in this state? That's a lot. And I have too. And I think that's another thing when we can think like we see patterns within the state, which is a relatively weak state from a policy point of view. So if we lived in California, we might have different things to say. California has been like at the front of every controversy over in math education. It's, as you said, Trish, in a way, it's been like not in the foreground here, but there are lots of state political issues here.
And my career started in Texas, which has a very different way of thinking about the centralization of education and educational authority. So there are ways in which things can happen in this state that can't happen in other states that have more centralized power. So it's something else for us to think about.
Okay, well, we hope that as we've designed this session, there'll be still more opportunities to see things that we're bringing from our connections with one another and our experiences across a lot of time in the state. So we'll move on just to sort of frame what we're doing. We spent a lot of time last night, disproportionate amount of time being silly about this slide. I was the one who came up with the shovel, and I was really questioned over and over by Macy, like, what is the shovel supposed to be? So my answer to that, she made me say I would explain why I picked a shovel, is obviously that's us. We were fighting over who says let's investigate. I guess it ended up I'm saying that. But anyway, the idea is this session's going to be an investigative session. We're going to be looking at artifacts and trying to see what kind of explanations and themes we can see that help us understand why there's been so much talk, but well, we'll decide whether we think there's been change, but we'll be looking at that. The shovel was meant to think about the metaphor that we're unearthing things that we may not have thought about. So that was my rationale. But then the binoculars were to be able to look far away at things. The microscope was to look more closely. And the airplane was to get a 5,000 or, 40,000 foot view of the whole enterprise. What do you want to add, since you were hard on me about this slide and you corrected
the first
the
shovel
slide
looked
multiple
like
times.
a literal shovel, and like she was going to hit my Lego person with the shovel. So that was my. But I think that what also is trying to be depicted here is like different scales of looking. Yeah. So we're going to have to go really microscopic at times, and then we're going to have to get to that really high level and overview. And you're also going to have to read that way. So some of the activities that we're going to ask you to do is not for you to like dig in completely and read each and every word and sentence, but to start like getting a survey of some things. So
now we wrote three questions that are guiding. Well, you'll see it's more than three questions, but three sort of central areas of questioning that we've designed to work on together during the session. So the first one is, what's been the sort of history of quote-unquote reform in U.S. math education? And just thinking historically, what problems does it seem to us that over decades, people who are trying to make change in mathematics education, what problems have they been trying to solve? And then they're sort of associated sub-questions that we'll be organizing to work on together. Like, who have been the people who've been framing these problems and claiming what the problems are? And what arguments have they been making about how we could solve those problems? And we're going to, again, look at things that can help us answer that together. Thinking a little bit about who these people have been, like whose interests have been served by these efforts over decades and who have not been served by these, who have been the actors and agents who's propelled efforts in math education. What does that tell us about the efforts? And then when have non-dominant communities actually advanced efforts to change mathematics education in their own interests and with their own visions and strategies? So that's one cluster of questions, is just like, who's been at this and what can we uncover about like underlying sort of forces that might be doing that, and who's been not part of that, but what else may have been going on? The second question is, what patterns are there in the discourse around reforms? We'll be reading and looking at some things and trying to think like whose perspectives or evidence shape the way the problems get framed and the narratives around what's going on and what needs to be going on. whose perspectives, seem to be dominating, and what evidence is there and what evidence seems to be missing. So we're always going to be trying to look at like what is there in what we're looking at, and what do we begin to notice is never there or doesn't seem to be there in the dominant sorts of ways things have been approached. And the third is sort of the basic question: what, if anything, has changed, and what explanations can we together sort of begin to hypothesize? Like, we already have ideas coming into this session. You shared some of them, but there may be some things we haven't yet really unearthed or surfaced to help us understand, like, what has been going on that might explain why there's so little change, and maybe what has never been going on that might explain that. And the goal of the whole session is that we leave here, each of us and collectively, with a few more concrete ideas of like, what could we be doing to have more agency about, and we're going to put this, as I think I said something about this yesterday, that we don't want to be here in 2033 having this exact same conversation. So that's the challenge, and it's a real one, because in 2013 we would have been having the same conversation, 2003 the same one, 1993, and some of you wouldn't have been there in those days. But it's just been a lot of the same discussion at math professional development sessions like this. So let's aspire to not be having this same conversation 10 years from now. And what does that mean as an action step? Some of us in our particular regions, and also collectively, what could we be doing? And we hope that the inquiries we do together will give us some concrete, instead of just feeling frustrated and noticing the lack of change, thinking like, that seems to be one thing that keeps being overlooked or keeps being done even though it doesn't work, or something like that. You want to elaborate anything? So this is the agenda. We're going to, why don't you do the agenda? I've been talking a lot.
That's fine. I will give you a break. So we did a little bit around framing our work, and now we're going to actually do some building together, okay? So we're pushing this idea of thinking about participation, so we're gonna work together, and we're gonna actually construct a timeline. And there's lots of ways to construct history. We're going to do it chronologically, we're not doing it thematically, and it's gonna require you to just be prepared. You're gonna have to talk about the year in which you were born. You're gonna have to get inside of that. And then from there, we're gonna actually move into two sets of discussions. One is addressing the questions that Deborah raised initially around levers and discourses of reform, the what, the who, and the power. Like, who has the power, who's holding that power, and what are they doing with it? We're then gonna look ahead again to the, again, another set of discussions, and then we'll just kind of open it up and we'll just kind of free flow, okay? So, yeah. Any questions about what we're gonna be doing together? So here's our orienting activity. We are going to give folks a piece of chart paper, and you need to go to the chart paper that represents the decade in the year that you were born. Got it? Don't have to disclose it, you can just, the decade. And you're gonna record three things on the top half of that piece of paper. One are major historical events. You might wanna just do some Googling maybe, or it might be a part of your own personal story. What was going on with popular culture then? And then what was going on with technology? So I want you to think about those three categories of things that we're gonna put on the decade posters, and I think we should have at least, what do you think, 3 groups? How many people do we have in the room? We're gonna do probably 3 timelines. You're right, Trish. We're gonna have to, when we build the math ed storyline, we're gonna need more posters. Yeah, so we're gonna have 2 per decade. Right. Yeah, you're just gonna draw a line in the middle of the chart paper. The top half is going to be the kinds of what was the social landscape during that decade. Got it?
So, do we want them up or on tables, Macy? Whatever. Okay. Okay. Well, we could. Why don't we just put up one now and then when people need more, we'll get.
Yeah. So
sorry.
help us.
Yeah. So 1900, 1910, the 1910s. Obviously, nobody was born there. We'll have to have a few before we get the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. We probably don't. I'm guessing we don't have people born in the 50s. Maybe, I don't know. 60s. Well, I am. I'm born in the 50s.
Find a marker at your table, grab a piece of chart paper, grab a paper, help us build this. So if you could turn and look at me for just 1 second, would you, at your posters, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or no, just give me a thumbs up if you can be ready in 4 minutes. Looks like we're ready. Okay, 4 minutes, then we're gonna do the next phase. Okay, thank you. That was a little over 4 minutes. What we're going to ask you to do, thank you so much. What we're going to ask you to do is a gallery walk, and this is probably the biggest gallery walk that I've ever seen. So move from poster to poster, just notice what people have written. If you feel really strongly, you might want to add something, but do it in a different color than what the team that was there working on. But just do the gallery walk. Notice from decade to decade. And I want you to resist doing it in order because it would just be a mob of us moving from poster to poster. So start and just notice.
Okay, everybody. So the next thing now is we're going to take a 7-minute break. We've broken our breaks into smaller chunks. You can do what you want with a 7-minute break, but we're going to begin the next activity using the timelines at 10 minutes after 10. So at that point, if you could come back to the front so we can set up the next part of our work at 10 after 10. But right now we're on break unless you're still enjoying talking about the timelines, which is fine too.
It's 10 after 10. We're starting.
Yeah.
Did I hear that you taught in East Lansing?
Yeah. Where? Spartanburg School.
Oh, wonderful.
Why?
I went to Marble.
You did?
Yeah.
What years?
Well, let's see. I went to Bailey the last year Bailey was a
Yeah.
school. So
We lived right in that neighborhood.
Oh,
We lived
where?
like 2 blocks from Bailey.
Where did you? I grew up on John Street. I grew up on Durand and Albert.
So what years were you at Marble?
I was at Marble from it would have been what 85 through
What grade did
90. I graduated in 96.
you high school? Yeah. So that's more like the age of my daughter. She graduated in 70s.
Who's your daughter? Oh my gosh! Of course, I know Sarah Ball. I know your daughter. Absolutely, of course I do. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You're more the age of my daughter, not
Yeah.
my son. My son went to Marble, but he's
Okay.
10 years younger.
Okay. Oh, gotcha. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
He was in 8th grade. He was in kindergarten at Marble in 95.
Okay. Yeah, and my wife also went to East Lansing, and she knows Sarah too. So Abby Siegel. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
She graduated in 96.
Yeah. Yeah. And my wife graduated in 98. So.
Okay, I'm going to text her.
And now my daughter goes to Marble, and my son is just starting. Yeah. Yeah. So I live right behind Marble now, and my son is just starting GSRP at Red Cedar.
I just like, incredible. I know. Did you go to Michigan State?
I went directly into TV. Yeah, I started working full time at TV News when I was 18. Yeah. With what?
Like technology.
Yeah, well, I grew up in it. Both of my parents were in media of some sort, so I grew up with cameras on my shoulder. Actually, I'm third generation television. My dad worked in TV and radio. My grandpa was a booth announcer at WLS TV in Chicago.
Radio announcer.
Oh, really? Oh, nice. Awesome. That's great.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I want to follow up with you. I'm going to send her a text.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's hilarious.
But I now work at Michigan State. So, yeah, my day job is actually with WKR, the PBS station in East Lansing. So I do a bunch of educational programming and things too. Oh, no, we've got spots open. Really? Yeah. Oh, excellent. Okay.
Okay, we had a little trip down memory lane there for a moment. So we're going to move to the next part of this activity. I don't understand. Okay. So, Macy, do you want to explain the next piece of this? You know what? This isn't refreshing, I think, Macy. Can we? I'll go back and talk to them. You can maybe start explaining it. We're going to be using these now as artifacts for the work on math education.
Okay, so we've built the skeleton for our timeline. And actually, could I just get 2 people to kind of talk about what it felt like to build this timeline?
Can you refresh? 'Cause
Maybe
Macy
someone
doesn't
who
have
was
this piece
inside
of
their
this.
own
Sorry,
decade and
thank
someone
you.
who was outside their decade. If you make eye contact with me, it's dangerous.
All right. Well, I was inside my decade of the 90s, and Kate and I had a very interesting conversation about how we feel like maybe, depending on when you were born in your decade, you might actually relate a little bit better to, especially the pop culture side of maybe the decade that followed. Right. So being born in the 90s, I felt like I related maybe a little bit more to what was going on in the early 2000s. But certainly going down memory lane and thinking of some of the cultural things that were going on at the time that I had no idea about because I was so young, or just not that I didn't have an idea, but I didn't become aware of until I was much older.
gives a very different perspective than those people who lived it. So much in the same way, I hear a lot about how our 9/11, which was so very real for all of us, feels very much like Pearl Harbor does to me. You know, to me, Pearl Harbor was something that I knew about and I read about, but it didn't have the emotional impact that it did for my grandparents. And starting to see that in our students today, where 9/11 is becoming that. And then looking at some of the other ones, we did notice repeats. Like we had PlayStation in ours, but then PlayStation was also listed in the early 2000s. So there were a couple of things that was like, okay, where's the line here? But otherwise, it was just a very, very interesting perspective. So.
Anyone else? What did it feel like to build time together?
So I was in the 1910s, and I know, right? But pulling up and looking for trends and then sort of cherry picking, because there's so much happening, and when you look back on it, 120 years later, but then also going through and seeing, like, what are the trends that we put on our posters that maybe we weren't really being aware of in other cultural respects? So that was just another lens that I looked at, both while I was putting things on the poster and then what I was looking came out in our posters, like these big moments that stuck out to us individually, but then created some interesting storylines around the room.
Thank you. Got one more?
So I worked with somebody in the 1930s, and when Googling the decade, I feel like the story was being told through the dominant culture lens. So we actually had to go another step to figure out, how did the Great Depression and how did the New Deal affect people who are black and brown and American Indians, and so it was like those stories were not being told in the dominant results from our Google search.
Fascinating, yeah. And like not fascinating and then not surprising, right? At the same time. So we're gonna move forward. Thank you for those comments, and I think we need to hold on to each of them. In terms of what feels close and what feels far away, what are the continuities that are like necessarily being represented, and then who's invisible and who's invisible, who's visible and who's invisible. We're gonna keep moving forward and building our timeline, and you're going to work. We did not know how many people. You see how we were ready for small pairs. I don't know what a small pair is, but anyway. But you know what I mean. So what we're gonna do is you're gonna read an assigned section of an article. It's an artifact, it's a history. History is always told, I think from the comment that you just made, from a perspective. And we right now are gonna step back and say, we're not gonna tell you much about how we feel about the perspective, good or bad, yes or no. It's just a perspective, and it's a useful tool that you're gonna use to complete the timeline. So we are gonna break into groups of 6, and you're going to be responsible for 2 decades. You're going to—
Except the first group, right?
The first group you have to
gets
cover
a
century and 20 years. But everyone else, you're gonna be focused on about 20 years. And as you read, you're gonna record key events in mathematics education, and then you need to be prepared to present your poster. And the presentation needs to be a tight presentation. Got it? How long is a tight presentation? 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Let's say 3 minutes. That's a good. So think about, as you're writing, how to create what you're gonna present. And then I want you to pull out from the reading these 3 things. What policies and social structures as related to math education, what curriculum is being described, and then the purposes. Why were people learning math? Okay? Those are the three key things that we want to make sure you pull out.
And I think in particular with respect to reform, what arguments, you see them in the arguments that are made for changing or improving math, what's underlying what the proponents or our debates are implying about why math matters and for whom. So, did you say we're reading an article?
I did.
Okay, yeah. I heard you talk about the perspective. Okay. So the article is going to be the main resource, right, to try to excavate things from that article, and it is, as you said, a perspective. What we're going to be doing with this, just so you see where we're going, might help you. So in a sense, you're out there investigating using your shovel and your binoculars and all of that, collecting some data and representing some data. What we'll do after that is analytically look across what you've pulled from that article to think about three kinds of things that go back to the questions that we're using for the whole session, and try to think about like who seems to be having power and whose interests are being represented and who's influencing those interests or fueling them or funding them. What role does the government have? Who's not being represented or not being, to your point, not showing up, not their interests not being represented. Another will be what levers, by levers we mean what tools or mechanisms are being used to try to change math. So what things are people saying, this is what we have to use or do, what things get promoted. An example that's easy to just say right now would be the standards movement and the multiple forms of standards. That's an example of a lever. It's like, oh, we're gonna change what happens in schools by developing a set of standards. And there's more to say about that, but that would be an example of a lever. And the third thing, probably the most abstract, is we're going to be trying to analyze, like, what do we notice about the discourses around math reform? So there we mean things like what language gets used, what metaphors, what perspectives or issues get foregrounded. So it's like, what do you see about that? That's not for you to look at in the article, but if you can think about these aspects as you do your what MAISA just went over, it will help all of us when we later try to figure, like, what are we seeing? What seems to be staying the same? What forces do we see over and over? And eventually, we're going to also be trying to think about, you know, what else in society was also changing the change? Because these posters show a lot of change, but we didn't really ask you the question, like, underneath all of that, what has been incredibly durable and unchanging in our society? So what does that have to do with the unchanging nature of math education? So that there's going to be quite a lot of analytic stuff a little later in the session. So as you collect data from the article, that will help you think what to record, that will help all of us do that work.
Perfect. Okay. If we could go forward one, and then we'll come back to this slide, because I want to give you a little bit of move forward just by one. Okay, so this is the QR code for that article. I just copy and pasted it into a Google Doc. The authors is represented. This is a pre-published version. Yeah, in the 90s, I want to say. Don't get me to lying. There's an airplane on the reading. What do you think that means? 50,000 feet. You are not trying to become an expert in this article. You're trying to pull out these key ideas so that we can just do this activity, okay? Read it like I read my dean's emails, right? Just 50,000 feet, just fly through, okay? We're gonna go around and I'm gonna number 1 through 6. You're gonna break into those. We'll probably do that twice, so there'll probably be 2 groups, each working on the different decades. Ready? This is what it's like to work with Deborah Ball. I'm just saying.
Okay, so how far did you get? Right, 1.
All right, into your groups. We're good.
I love you.
I love you too. Right. There should be 2 sets of 1s, though. That's the thing. Everyone's a 1. 1, table 1. Table 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, back there. You'll have 20 minutes. You will have 20 minutes. Yes.
The name of that feels really familiar.
It'll be 1960 to 1980, like with salmon. Okay, thanks. And you're going to be looking for these three things: policies and structures, math, education, like the curriculum itself, and then what were people saying? This is why we need to educate people in math.
Is this one of the, you teach a history on that course? So it's not a like course specific on history, but it's woven into.
It's woven. It's mostly woven into like PD work.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. I appreciate you bringing it to this space. Yeah.
Oh, sure. To look at something else and I can't find it. Move it back because I think people are like, we're not the only. I didn't know that it wouldn't like put it in the folder. So that there we go. I think I want to share that because like the last. If you can tell me what decade they came from. You already have this. The black photos. Yeah. Oh. They're almost. They should be almost done. Right? We should be moving forward. What was the question? It was, what decade did these? No, but what did you ask them? Because she said, I don't know. I just never. No, these are just quotes. So I want to encourage you, if you have not done so, which I don't think anyone has, is to start moving to your posters and recording these ideas. So start trying to record and then also start nominating someone to do your brief presentation. Oh, so this is what do you think? What decade is it from? Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure what clues I would use. This seems like somebody. This seems far longer ago to me. How? What's the span? What's the earliest I could guess? I would guess like this is like. Oh no, you're not doing anything that old. No, there's stuff from much older. Much older. Oh, okay. So I would say that's like.
way contemporary.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll have to tell me what I should be tracking on. So this is.
I think the point for me is that there aren't good clues inside of it.
Oh.
Because the Black experience is not
Similar.
shifted.
Is what?
This is 1940. This is my grandmother.
Grandmother, and I read about her. Yeah. I was thinking it'd be. Yeah. Okay.
I don't remember this one. And the next one is 1980.
1980. And this is from which project?
I was doing a PD for one of Beth hired me to do a PD with some of the teachers she was working with.
What I was. This is really interesting. But where did you get the quotes?
They were from different. That's what I was trying to look for. They were from different interview articles. This is from Ebony McGee's article.
Oh,
this
I
is
see.
my
That's
article.
really clever. Yeah, this is from yours, right?
Yeah.
I should have remembered because I remember your name. Yeah.
That's
It's
a real
such a
name.
great name.
That's a real name. I had a daughter. That's her name.
I guess that. I know I was about to say that.
Can't remember where I put that one, but that was. This was
Really,
the oldest.
I think this.
Yeah.
Somehow the way that this person's talking about the way school was, and the way Black is getting this person makes me back older. That's really a good activity. So you've done this kind of timeline before.
Yes, and then I do something similar for 3 years too.
Do you like how this is playing out?
Are you okay if I include some of these?
The analytic part is going to be.
I think we're gonna have to work with the groups. I think we might need to just like
be at the poster and
yeah, we maybe let them. I think with respect to time, because we only have an hour left. We wanna
break it again.
Yeah.
We're doing okay though because this next chunk wasn't meant to be so long. We could stand with posters and just have people think of those questions reasons about what physics versus what levers.
Yeah, and we can just as a group construct it instead of.
I think that's right.
Yeah, instead of like.
Is it too
sitting
big a
down.
group to be walking around together?
I don't think so. We need each other to play off. I would need you.
Okay. That means I say things.
Where should this go? Maybe right after they present.
No rush or refreshing it. Do we have, we probably have, what happened to all the textbooks that were in 1,500?
I don't know if we got rid of all of them, but
Because we should make a collection of the sample of decades, because we have, I have earlier stuff and so do you. But those are like 70s, 80s, well, I think we have some 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. And it might be smart to keep that. I mean, people have kept those 19th century ones. That was the Funda that we have them. And that isn't necessarily the books we're using in Black school would be good to have in our collection. Like I mean, you could just build a small collection. It'd be interesting. But before we throw them all away, let's sample it. Maybe that's
I don't know if they haven't been thrown away.
Maybe that's something I can get the people I'm paying quarterly to work on at some point. I need some little, I want them to do a few little things. Don't you think? I don't see any reason why they shouldn't, and I think it'll be good for them to have a similar schedule. This thing with my lessons makes me really pissed off. I just want you to know, like, I keep coming back to it and thinking all of this is really infuriating. What was the thing that teachers said in the video? Nothing makes me more infuriated. What, nothing infuriates me more. What makes me, that when people don't
do what they did on their paper.
contact board, that's what I was saying. Nothing makes me looked in the executive committee folder. I looked at the executive committee folder. We have a retreat next Tuesday. So about 5 reports of us.
All right, I think we should start doing them. Okay, we really need to start in 2 minutes. Do we just want to do a gap? So try to make your last marking on your chart paper and start migrating towards the beginning of the timeline where we're going to hear our first presentation. Try to complete the thought that you're on right now and move towards the beginning of your timeline, our timeline. Posters do not have to be perfect or complete. Just find that end thought and move towards the beginning of our timeline. And Rob, when you get a chance, can you refresh the presentation? Rob, can we refresh the presentation again? Oh, you're fine. Come on. You got to do it like Huey Lewis, though. But back in time. That's not my personality. I just try to self-deprecate my way into compliance.
Friends, if you would like to join us in this upper corner, we would love that to happen. I invite you to come over here. There we go. Exactly. That is perfect for the 1900s. So. All right, so I'm Diane Owen Rogers. I'm from the MySTEM Network. I was voluntold to be the speaker for our group, so my group is going to add in if there's things that I will eventually leave out, I'm sure. So we are the 1900s. There were a couple of key thought leaders that we read about, and those were John Dewey, his protege was Kilpatrick, and then also Thorndike, I think. And the thing that was interesting about those three are that they were more from the education world, not the political world. So they were general education kind of folks and psychologists, and then thinking about the role of mathematics in kind of this more uniformity of education. So the Committee of 10 was started in 1892. That was outside of our article, but they decided that progression of Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2 should be in 4 years of high school, and that was to help matriculate people into college. And so the purpose of like high school was kind of some preparation of college, but also sorting people into the workforce. So there was a lot of conversation about how do we build that structure and that system across the country. And so there was an argument in the article we were reading about the role of Algebra 1 and geometry, and that really this is only for the elite, that it's actually harmful to the common worker. And we were surmising that that's probably because then people might not want to be producing farming and things like that, that literally is feeding the country. And so how do we keep people sort of in their place? We don't educate them as much. There was also some conversation about like, there was a statement by Snedden, it was a, I think, psychologist as well, and he said, 90% of boys don't need Algebra 1 and geometry, and 99% of girls don't. So there was a sexism kind of piece. There was no mention about people of color, so there's kind of an assumption here that really education, especially algebra and geometry at the college level, would be for like white males. There was also kind of an interesting philosophy for Dewey and then on to Kilpatrick about having slower paced curriculum that was student centered and more inquiry or exploratory in the learning. Okay. And then the purpose of math and the mental discipline part, there was an argument about that of like utilitarian versus like mental exercise. So, anything you want to add?
Thank you. Yeah, now to 1920s, unless there's questions, comments for this group. Anybody? Different historical read? Anyone?
Who's representing this?
Okay, so starting on. Okay, so we did the 1920s to the 1939, so 20s span through the 30s. So we are building off of the ideas of the early 1900s. So Kilpatrick at the time is still the dominant narrative. And his idea really stems on this idea that algebra and geometry are not needed, that they are intellectual luxuries, and that we really need to focus on practical math. NCTM was created and created this 1923 report, which was this big deal. It was like this counteractive, like we shouldn't be doing that math really should be for every educated person, and that algebra and geometry were needed. However, Kilpatrick really still dominated the narrative, and so even though NCTM was created and sort of pushing this idea, this also came out the idea that like reform was coming from teachers, not so much from like the intellectual and political and sort of like more educated, like higher up in education, but more from teachers on the ground. But this idea that Kilpatrick had was still very dominant in the 1920s. Then we looked at a table which showed which showed that this idea that Kilpatrick had that algebra and geometry weren't necessary was proved to exist because you saw a steady decrease of about 10% of students that were enrolling in algebra and geometry throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and I think that even continued through the 40s and 50s, which our other groups will probably talk about. And then we get into the 1930s. Where now we're leading into this idea of the activity movement, which really talked about math being integrated with other subjects, and math not being a standalone subject. So this really took roots with teachers saying that we need to drive education and curiosity based on what children are interested in, rather than focusing on these like very specific different subjects. This is similar to what happened in the 90s, where we get a lot of like resistance from families, a lot of resistance from like the populace, but is still the driving narrative. And then NCTM sort of shifts away from their ideas in the 1920s and are really pushing this movement of this integration and really pushing educators to get on board with this activity movement. That all subjects should be integrated together and not separate. And I think by the end of the 1930s, this had taken complete hold in elementary. It was a little bit harder in high school because high school teachers are sort of trained in specific disciplines. So this was harder for educators, even with NCTM sort of pushing this, harder for them to get on board, but it was still sort of like the driving narrative of the time. Anybody from my group have anything to add? No? No?
Okay. Well, we're going to head to the future because we should be hopeful, right? Okay. NCTM was mostly teachers, right, at that time. NCTM was truly teachers.
Was what?
At its inception, NCTM the membership was teachers. Yeah. Yes.
Kind of like NCTE has, I think the NCTE, but especially NSTA, the Science Teachers Association, is still much more teachers than it is researchers. They have NARST for the researchers and STA for teachers, whereas NCTM gradually became like a huge mush of people, yeah.
So now we get to the 1940s, and the policy was called the Life Adjustment Movement, which was really driven by the Army because they were having to teach math to new Army recruits and blamed that on public schools not doing a good enough job, that soldiers were coming into the Army and not knowing how to do basic things that needed to be done.
So World War II is like a really important context.
Yes. So They
training
wanted
new
schools-
officers, and so, as we kill officers, we're running out of people that know how to do math.
Yeah. So schools were wanting to focus more on an academic curriculum, but 60% of the population, they surmised would not need that. So they really wanted to do more like practical skills, practical math, things for just like that small percentage of people who wouldn't go on to academia. So that kind of led into the 1950s with this policy called New Math, which sounds familiar, right? So now we have this collision between logical and exploratory math. Calculus was added at the secondary level, which educators and families were really unprepared for. Like educators didn't really know how to teach this like more theoretical math, and at home, families were not able to support. Again, does this sound familiar at all? So the government blamed the fact that Russia created Sputnik. They blamed that on our lack of education, and so that we didn't. It was embarrassing that they did that first. So they blamed that on educators again. So they created the National Education Defense Act, and they really wanted to focus more. They wanted to go back, focusing more on academic skills versus those practical skills, because now we have this increase in engineering and technological advances, and we need people to be able to contribute to that. So that brings us to the 1960s. The policy is still New Math, but it's now being criticized highly by many mathematicians. And mathematicians are now being invited to contribute to math curriculum for the first time. So 64 mathematicians signed a letter and offered new guidance for math instruction. So the curriculum is still the same, but it's now being assessed for effectiveness by lots of independent agencies. NCTM is also getting involved in this. And again, the purpose is just now we're behind in this scientific and engineering revolution, and we need to get up to speed. Anything to add from?
So I would add a little bit more cutting language here. It was for national defense and national security, and to promote the national economy. So there's discourses of economic competitiveness and our national security. That's what's...
The Cold War, yeah.
Yeah, Cold War stuff. Got it, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add that language.
And that begins with Sputnik, right? So it
yeah, and Sputnik was also thinking through national defense. Thank you, this is a great job. Great job. Any surprises? You getting hopeful though? So what's changing?
Yeah.
It started off, the who was what initially? Who was making these decisions? Who had the power? Before then, who? Professors.
And mostly in psychology.
Mostly in psychology.
So that's an important thing to hold on to for where we're going.
Then what was next? Yeah.
Yeah, the government.
Okay. With who's backing, whose voice? Math professors. Okay.
These are
mathematicians.
These are mathematicians.
Yeah. To the new math. They weren't behind it. Got it.
Teachers being men to teachers being women, and when teachers' thoughts started being excluded.
Say that again.
Can you say it again, please, Kylie?
I said I was thinking about the progression of when teachers were mainly men to when teachers were mainly women, and when their opinions started being excluded.
Just an observation. Just an observation. Let's keep moving forward.
So we're going to the 70s and 80s?
Yeah.
I think we'll be relatively brief. Our section felt a little brief, but kind of a bridge maybe between these. The big movement that we read about was called the Open Education Movement, which was going back to kind of stations and exploration at different stations and letting students kind of go around. But what was found and what was voiced in the article mentioned a Black educator kind of bringing this to the attention is that was really privileging affluent children, that minority and poor children weren't being successful here because they weren't getting the additional supports at home. And what does it look like for those children? So in response to that, maybe, or to go against it, states designed minimum competency tests, these basic fact tests, to not necessarily say don't do this, but to really show that it wasn't being successful, that these play movements weren't working, and then just to additionally note that new math was dead. One of the things we were really talking about is who was leveraging the privileges here, and the article made it clear that it was a Black educator that was acknowledging that. It got our table talking a bit about how long did that take to get voiced and to get recognized.
So what, from a curriculum point of view, what replaced the new math? New math was dead, but what came in then?
Yep.
So during this period, I guess it isn't shown in this article, there's a very large move toward individualized instruction in math and in reading, as it was called. So there would be boxes where students just worked through cards individually and took tests. There's a very well-known article about the individualized programmed instruction in math that showed a boy who kept advancing by guessing the answers by aligning it with the test and just keep moving on. So kids were just working completely alone and moving through cards in both reading and math. So and it was all about very basic skills.
We had conversation around what was happening politically, less politics, more culturally, that there seemed to be a battle between the free thinkers and the free love and that thing fighting against authority, and then the people who were still trying to claim it, right? And so there seemed to be some discourse around, here's the response that we're gonna have to this cultural piece. And so from there came some of the things like statewide minimum testing as a result, or response to free education.
Would this have been mastery learning, or would that have been later?
When did MEP start? So MEP goes there too.
But was this, was the Iowa Basic Skills Test here? Was that 70s
I'm just asking
or 80s?
Iowa Basics, when did?
It started here.
Earlier in the 70s, then MEP. Does that sound right?
Basic skills was started in the 60s.
Okay.
Right. But Iowa Test of Basic Skills was a national test produced at the University of Iowa.
Terra Nova, that's right.
So you said education professors, math professors. Is this more like individual teachers everywhere, just sort of who's designing the work here?
I think this is when we start, I'll take a venture at it. These programs that I was describing before were developed by companies. So companies were producing these boxes of individualized, color-coded, individual programs, and districts were beginning to buy programs. So maybe that's where we first, we don't have evidence about that earlier, but the influx of corporate business.
But that was what we said in our poster. That was when we started talking about, okay, we're starting to see that there's a lot of money to be made in public education.
Yeah, but the commodity, this Well, like for example, the curricula produced during the new math, what was it called, School Mathematics Study Group, was produced by universities, like really, look like newsprint copy, like not the kind of polished curriculum we begin seeing in the 70s. I think this is where we begin seeing the production of corporate and commodification of curriculum shows up more here than earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I was going to add to that is that new math there was a big pushback by families and communities. And so I think this is kind of a place where space was being open because people were not taking it up. Yeah. So I think this is like the space is being open, and then we get to see who steps into the space.
But as somebody who began teaching in the 70s, it wasn't like we were all making up our own stuff. We were told what to be using, so. But there's an open space.
There's an open space that's going to get occupied. Who's speaking next? Who's next?
So we're going to 80s and 80s?
80s.
So in the 80s, and I think all of us have been in education long enough that like now we feel these threads and the impact that they've had in our own. So from the 80s to the 2000s, there were really this tension between two things: the NCTM principles and standards, which were really written right by that organizational, at that organizational level, and a nation at risk. That was really like a call to action, right? So the government was saying, we've got to do something. And it's interesting, some of the things that they were saying why, the amount of remediation that needed to happen in college classrooms when it comes to mathematics. I think there was a teacher shortage going on during this time. There's just lots of very parallels, right, to what we have happening right now. NCTM was really advocating for problem solving, being more cooperative in the classroom. And it was interesting, they used different language, but they talked about trying to build student confidence, right? Where we're talking more about like identity. And so, but they did make a point in the article to say that these things were top down. They were coming either from policymakers, from government, or from national organizations, but there really weren't teachers at the table when it came to these reforms. And so that tension sort of played out both like states on the one hand were writing their own standards, but there was pushback from like parent groups, and California in particular decided to write their own set of standards that was very different from NCTM. And I would ask somebody in my group to speak more about that if you have questions, because our section was really long to read, and but we really thought some context that was important here was that this was really about college level preparation in a post-Sputnik era, and then that nation at risk was really like, are we preparing our learners for college readiness? And I'll stop there, and I'm sure others in the group can draw parallels or say something.
The only part to add about why California decided to create their own set of standards, they compared it to the reading wars. So they compared the NCTM standards to like the whole language approach, and that they were lacking in the foundational skills. So their arithmetic and algebraic skills were lacking, and so that's why they decided to write their own set of state standards to focus on those skills again.
Department of Ed person in California was one of the authors or backers of the Nation at Risk work. So she took it and put it into action in her state.
I mean, the 80s is when I think about the Back to Basics movement. So I just want to kind of name that it was the these aren't working, the Back to Basics movement.
Is more a little earlier.
It's the 80s to the 2000s.
Well, this is when NCTM comes out with problem solving and all of that, so it gets away from that, right? California was like even more ambitious. California stuff was really ambitiously different.
Mm-hmm.
Are you disagreeing with me?
I'm not disagreeing.
Oh, okay. No, I'm just asking if we're saying different things.
But I think we're talking about what got filled in from the 70s and what's getting taken up
We also
here.
see an exacerbation of this national, global kind of competitiveness. This nation at risk is the most dramatic language about the country is going to fail and die, and linking these arguments to global competitiveness.
Don't we know now that nation at risk, some of that crisis was actually hyped as a means to prevent the federal Department of Education from being eliminated? Does that?
I don't know that discourse.
Okay.
I didn't quite understand the question, Kathy. I'm sorry.
Say it again.
No, the question was, do we? It seems like I've read somewhere, maybe on the internet, so it may not be true, but that some of the crisis that was presented in A Nation at Risk was exaggerated because A Nation at Risk was written as a document to prevent the federal government from eliminating the federal Department of Education.
Yeah, I think that is right. I think
isn't
it was,
that? I mean,
yeah.
it certainly had the effects that it had.
Yeah.
But don't we know now that some of that is that crisis is actually over exaggerated?
Yeah, I think many people, many critics of that would say that.
I mean, the thing I would pull out of that is that the nation at risk, like, think about the language here.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it helps us, like, frame everything that we do as educators as a crisis. So I think holding on to that is thinking about some of that.
Like what we're seeing right now, like the discourses right now, right?
Right. Next poster. Who's the speaker here?
I guess that's me. I'll call for some help because we've got a lot of acronyms, so we're entering the age of acronyms here in the 2000 and beyond era. We really had a hard time putting it all together because part of this was looking at history and part of this was looking at our own lived experience, because now we're in an era that we don't think about as history. This is just stuff we do. Going back, we tried to look back at some of the things that NCTM came out with, help me out with PSSM, principles and standards for school mathematics. Thank you. And in here, we're starting to get the political takeover. So we've got No Child Left Behind and accountability coming in, and Race to the Top, which No Child Left Behind kind of turned into. We have the Glicks and Huskies that didn't actually stay around long enough for any kid to get all 13 years of them. That shifted into Common Core state standards, which are now getting some pushback from another group with the science of math. And similar to what we saw before, we see grassroots groundswell movement against it, somewhat from states, somewhat from locals. It's coming from all over. And then people mentioned Texas before. We have Texas and California traditionally pushing our textbooks because of their high population numbers. But we're also starting to see we have institutes of higher ed there and professors starting to get some more influence. And then another big shift here in my bad drawings, we have textbooks turning into new curriculums going online, partly because of vendors with good lobbyists that show up in our state budget now, and artificial intelligence, and this is my COVID virus down there, shifting us more online, but also thinking about things like with College Board and Khan Academy being the thing that was free and gonna get everybody on a level playing field because it's free. Well, now we're gonna be taking College Board assessments online, and if you want the thing to help you, it's now AI driven and costs money. So we're getting away from that level playing field again and kind of going back to the old Kaplan days where you paid for your SAT. Sorry, that was my soapbox, that was not the group. I just gotta put that out there. But now we've got the same balance going on that we've seen before between procedural fluency and conceptual understanding, and we're still in that same tug of war today.
What's the language and discourse going on right now about that?
In here, we've got, like, is it traditional textbook? Do we do 30 problems, or is 7 enough for practice? And also thinking about the idea of, is faster always better? We've really got this push going on in the background towards show your understanding. And the shift in some of the language here about what you have to do goes from do the problem, get it right, or the rocket's gonna crash, to you better be able to understand it and explain it to your grandma. Oh, yeah, sorry. And we had a little discussion because earlier when we had the question about whether it was, should 10% of the population take algebra at all, this is also the era of Michigan requiring Algebra 2 for all students.
And I wasn't in this group, but a question I had about what we just talked about was microphone. You guys could use it. Thank you. One question that I thought about when you were presenting just now is, right now we're also having conversation back to pathways of we need people in trades versus college, right? And so when we think about college readiness and all of the classes that we do that Common Core has us take, there is a conversation as to where do we want students to go after school. And that wasn't there necessarily in the 90s and 80s.
Just to add on from our group, I think a big theme here is taking sides. We take political sides about Common Core. You're taking sides about tracking or not tracking. We're taking sides about teaching traditionally teacher-centered or teaching student-centered, teaching with technology, teaching without technology. And this is all of our lived experience, but that taking sides, and you know, we've talked about college professors around the room. I think we're seeing the taking sides with college professors now. You have movements of someone like Jo Boaler, and then she is like slammed to the ground, criticized by people at her university who take a different side. So this big taking sides, and then we have it with our parents too. I don't co-parent with the government. I get to pick curriculum, taking sides.
I think the other thing to be mindful of is that all of these suggestions are coming through documents, and they're coming they were like papers through organizations, and then there's written standards. What we haven't seen any reference to is what's there to be the supportive structure to actually take these statements and these documents into practice. And so when we think about even the shifts that we've had since some of us have been teaching, it's all been, the learning hasn't been about reports on sustained learning for teachers and sustained systemic supports. Other than, I think at California Dreaming, that's when it was lifted, is that what the power of practical, practice-based, professional learning that's sustained over time can do, and yet it's less about that and more about all these documents.
So I think that's what we want to try to focus on in our last time together. Are we going to keep standing, or should we go?
We should go sit down, but I think the thing that I also want to lift that's happening right now, and a discourse that we just want to track on, is the notion of science of math. Y'all have heard of that, right? Right, it's on there.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to, but if we're tracking language, new math, and science of math, and give me another one, somebody help. Open school movement, back to basics. We want to think about how this language is framing things and creating these kinds of political polarization that we're seeing.
A couple other things to maybe lift up that are kind of bigger than the math ed stuff are the questions about research-based and evidence-based, and what's meant by that is another thing going on. And then the word science, like there's the science of reading, there's the science of math, there's about evidence. We don't see that way back, but pretty early we start seeing arguments being made based on evidence, but it's completely unclear what it is that evidence is being produced about, or what it means to have evidence that shows that something works. But that becomes a dominant part.
Sure, and what this group is helping me see now, that I think I have words for now, is that the polarization that was happening was often between disciplinary communities, be them psychologists, teachers, education researchers. And what I think is interesting about this political moment is that now researchers, educational researchers, are factionalizing. So they're like developing factions within the, within the research
Well, the science of
community.
math people are researchers, right? They're psychologists, again, special education researchers.
Right.
So the dominance of psychology is another, mathematicians and psychologists is something to notice.
Right. I think it's important to name that the science of math movement are special education researchers who take a primarily psychological and developmental psychology perspective that's framing what good math is, okay? But we should see connections to that, to other perspectives or that psychologists have had as well.
Let's go back to our tables and try to think about some of what isn't here and what that helps us understand about change. Mics around.
Take a break. We should take a break. So please take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and end out the session, okay? Okay, we're gonna pull back together. I did not have these slides in here originally, but based on some of the comments that were coming up, I've done this activity before with folks, and one of the things that I'm often trying to do, my work is thinking about learning and thinking about how race and gender and class mediate learning opportunities. And so what I have is often interviews, historical interviews where I'm thinking about what was it like to be a Black learner in the United States in mathematics. And I am not going to read all of these to you, but there's 3 different quotes here, and I can send these to you by email, and I'll challenge you to figure out in what decade, beginning in the 1900s to today, that these quotes came from. And the punchline is, I doubt that you will get all 3 correct, because the experiences of Black folks in mathematics classrooms has not changed. And I'm not even gonna say changed that much. It has not changed. So we were gonna do this. We're running out of time. It doesn't mean that their voices aren't important, but we did wanna nod to this because we really wanna focus on our voices in the room and doing something about this, not just reading it. But there are other artifacts that we could pull from as we start trying to populate timelines. So we're gonna kind of walk through. We've already done this in our gallery walk together, and those were really lovely presentations. Thank you all for your hard work. And we're gonna make some high-level comments. We invite those of you that if you have something to say that you haven't had an opportunity to say, that this is the time. But Deborah's gonna kind of respond to some of these questions and show you what we've been thinking about with respect to this issue of change and reform in math ed.
Are we starting with this one? Do you want me to start? Yes. Okay, so one lever that seems pretty clear that I think we heard almost in every decade is how curriculum is repeatedly used as one of the primary levers. People keep building curriculum materials. We see it really early over and over again. We see resistance against those materials. We see big money becoming part of those materials. Curriculum materials, and we see that right now as well. Now we have open source materials, school districts are picking those. We keep using curriculum as the way to change what learners experience and what learners learn. A whole session could be done. We have a pretty good collection of curriculum materials, looking at them from the 19th century to now, and although they cosmetically look different, it would be a very good session just to look at how much is anything really changing in those materials. So that is one of the levers, and that's something to be on the lookout for. And that raises, I think, a second point I'll make and go. Yeah,
nuance what you said. So we do see changes. What are the changes that it bounces back between 2 things? What are the 2 things that curriculum is bouncing back between? Speak. Basics and problem solving. Right. So it's like advanced mathematics, but the way that you get to advanced mathematics is either through problem solving, conceptual understanding, or procedural fluency.
We may want to actually look at them at some point, because also the story of math curriculum materials has been adding things in, not taking things out. So actually the curriculum I taught with in the 1970s, which was the basics movement, has tons of word problems in it. The next decade just add more things. Real math just was that plus other things. It's kind of like things don't get really taken out. I said to you the other day, the work that we did in Detroit a couple of weeks ago, the place value work looked exactly like the work in the 1970 book that I used. And the same problems with why children wouldn't understand place value, and it looks the same as 50 years, 40 years ago. The second thing that implies that I'll put out, and then there are several other things, is that at no point have we really heard anything about teaching or the work of teaching or any of the things, or the work of, or I should hand over to you, almost nothing about learning. So there have been lots of things to understand about learning. So learning and teaching, arguably, and children are the core. That's what we worked on the last couple of days. This is all battles about who has power and what the curriculum materials are. So you should?
I feel like the discourses of learning are baked into the curriculum, because if we're focused on problem solving, the way that we're constructing learning is more through oftentimes can be situated in social cultural perspectives. And then when we move to the back to basic stuff, it's more about cognitive theories of learning. So we're kind of bouncing back between these theories and not embracing the power of either one of them in any given moment.
So what other levers of reform did you notice? What gets used to try to make change or to argue about change?
Testing.
What?
Testing.
Testing. So the testing begins to emerge most, when did we say, about the 60s? 70s. Yeah, 60s and 70s. They're testing, companies producing tests that districts were using, states start producing tests. There's an increasing pressure on teachers for test results. So in the 1970s, the pressure wasn't on test results, they were just given. But they became part of the instrument, and they've become increasingly part of the instrument. What? Crisis language, yeah. Crisis is part of the lever, so declaring a crisis, yeah, yeah. So let me differentiate here maybe between, I think it doesn't matter too much between levers and like discourses. So there are discourses that go on, but there are levers that when you want to make change, what do you decide to use or do? And curriculum materials is one of those. And what doesn't get used is advances in knowledge about learning, doesn't get used like actually what we called generously the other day, ordinary people who have to do this work of teaching really don't, that work doesn't ever really come into focus. It's kind of like you implement to suggest that you get material and you just, somehow that you just do it like it's instrumental, and any of us who's taught knows that that word doesn't even work for what teaching is.
So I think I would just name two levers then, which is like teacher evaluation. If we evaluate teachers a certain way, then we can change what's in the classroom. And then I don't know if it's a lever or not, but I'm feeling a tug between who are the people making the decision. So like school psychologists are very much influencing what's happening in mathematics. And I often think, but what do they know about mathematics? So I'm not really sure how to frame that as a lever, but
no, there's two questions. What do they know about mathematics and what do they know about classrooms?
And I think we mean educational psychologists, right? Not school psychologists.
Right, you mean,
yeah.
Okay.
School
And
psychologists are
part of the
people who
reason
like
I say
testing
that
of
is because most of the work that cognitive psychologists do with children, it's important work, is in a clinical setting. Do you know what that, so that means I am pulling you out, decontextualizing everything, putting something in front of you, and then I'm making an argument about how children think. And it never happens in the context of Deborah's sitting right next to me and she's got this really juicy thing that she wants to tell me, and the teacher's talking, and what the interactions between peers and the full complexity of what you deal with on a day-to-day basis is not typically what is driving what we say children know about math, right? They're totally decontextualized. That's why that participation metaphor for me is so important.
So anyway, the discourses matter. I didn't mean to offset that arguments about the nation and risks to the nation. It's just that's less of a lever. The lever is the discourse then, which is right. But it's like what things do you build when you want to make change? Okay, so who's been involved? We already said psychologists have been involved, mathematicians have been involved. Who else has been involved?
politicians.
Who? Professional organizations?
Politicians, parent groups, publishers, students in reform. Yes, okay. They should be. Have they been?
Who?
Students. You're making me want to do a study on what maybe local movements have students been able to change mathematics locally. Maybe. That's interesting. So how many students don't like mathematics? or how they're like that kind of thing? I see. Got it.
I brought that up because as a student, granted I was a college student, I had a story to tell that could have influenced reform. And so I don't know that students' experiences, they're told from themselves, are being considered in reform.
Amen. That's my entire research agenda. Is trying to lift that up and highlight that. I mean, I think a question, and should we go ahead and move forward? Because we have 10 minutes.
Let's go to the discourse one.
Yeah.
So there's a dominance of a gap discourse. The only way we really saw anything at all about race in this particular article was about gaps. And we see that still, that's the only reference is normatively using white students and testing to have a gap discourse. And
the gap, go ahead.
Go.
The gap discourse gets deployed, so we talk about Black children,
right.
And the gap discourse gets deployed often to do what? To go to the back to basics.
Right.
We never argue on behalf of Black children for deeper, more conceptual, poor children. We don't argue for that. We use Black voices and stories to often argue for, let's get back to the basics.
And the acquisition metaphor, right?
And the acquisition metaphor.
And the other gap discourse is the global one. So yesterday I was at a meeting in the morning, which is why I wasn't here, and what we saw were data about how the United States is now, what did I tell you, 30th in the world. We've lost 20 years of gains in math instruction. That's absolutely not true at all. But that discourse is being, again, crisis discourse and global gaps. So gaps are a big driver, and then assumptions about what to do to fill those gaps.
I also want to, like, the language and slogans, the use of science and
the word science.
And science of math is doing interesting work, right? So it conveys that it is official, it's authoritative, and I think we need to be paying attention to how people are trying to frame, and I would say manipulate, a discourse about mathematics and whose evidence counts. So I don't know if some of you are in the room because you're concerned about that discourse, or some of you are proponents of it, I don't know. But I think being really careful about how we deploy this language to influence these things without a lot of evidentiary basis for it.
So I think we wanted to use the last few minutes to think, where do we go from here? What will change require? So given what we've been seeing across this, more than 100 years, what are some things we need to be doing as leaders, as educators, as people worried about this, to begin to actually do things that could make change? What mistakes do we not want to keep making, or what do we want to be aware of and bear witness to and fight against? What are the levers that we should be using in the various places that we work? Who needs to be involved in that, and what discourses could we change? How could we influence those?
Can I bring it even just closer to your work, probably starting next week, is there are these essential practices. These essential practices could have come at any point in these decades, right? So how do we make sure that the good work that's being done here does not just fall flat? Or is it typical for you to be, look at all of you in this room. Is this a moment of some kind that we need to recognize? I'm asking, or maybe you would say this is what we do. Yeah.
We can take this work forward. Sorry. Just based on my role, right? I'm the Associate Superintendent of Special Education, and I think me being at the table with our general education curriculum leaders and talking about early math is one step forward. I was kind of encouraged to come kicking and screaming, I think, like, what the heck am I going to do here, right? And I found, like, on the, this is the last day, and I've had 3 great days of exploration and learning in a way that I wouldn't have done had I not come. So I think that one of the leverages that we can make is bringing more people along in the conversation and ensuring that the conversation doesn't die, right? And so I just think that being active and bringing more people into the conversation of the math essentials and lifting the work and ensuring that it doesn't die.
To that point, is it outside of math, like the typical players? It can't be the typical players.
So I'm going to be kind of thinking out loud as I go through here, trying to figure out how to phrase what I mean by the leverage of what we've already been doing, because sometimes you see things coming and going, and sometimes it seems as if we come to teachers as if this is this brand new right way to do things, and we talk with our students, acknowledging that our students don't come to us as empty vessels. They come to us with backgrounds, with history, with some mathematical knowledge, and there are things that are already happening in our classrooms, in our schools. These aren't like brand new schools where no teaching and learning has been happening. So as we work with teachers and schools and everybody that needs to be involved, looking at what is already happening that is working or not working, how do these essentials relate to maybe we're already doing some of them. Maybe there are practices that they contradict with, so what do we need to get rid of? Or maybe there are barriers in place, but this concept that we're going to write these new standards and, if we just do back to the basics, or if we just are more mathematically rigorous, or if we just do problem solving, that's ignoring the fact that something is already happening now. And I think that needs to be part of the conversation.
The challenge for me in what you're saying, I'm hearing you. It's like, how do we honor what's already happening? The challenge is, if the work is already being done, then we're getting what we're getting. So if all we're doing is grafting the essentials onto things that we're already doing, then what do we expect on this next set of posters out here at 2040?
I guess I'm saying it's more than just grafting on, but recognizing something is happening already. And if we don't recognize what's already happening, then what we do get is just grafting on. We have to recognize what's already happening so that we can decide when do we add on, if it has to be if we're talking about a huge change, we need to actually recognize that we're talking about a huge change, or when we're talking about little changes, so that we can discard those things that need to be discarded.
I'm hearing you. I'm
processing. The issue
processing.
that you're pointing out is that often we're adding things that are in conflict with what's already there, or we're actually trying to change something that's there. Sometimes there are things we can build on. So acting as though everything is blank and we're starting anew. We have a love affair with like innovation and novelty, but thinking more of a process of like systemic learning would include what probably both of you are saying, right? I think that Christy was next.
Well,
you.
Just to clarify and also to piggyback on what Kylie said. So I think the way that students' voices their voices haven't been heard, just data about them, right? So they've been talked about in these themes, but we haven't heard their voices. And I think that there are groups that are listening to students, and I think the most powerful moment for me in the last 3 days was seeing the student in the testimonial camera that Dr. Parks brought up, saying like, why can't there just be more joy in learning? But I know that the culturally relevant team has gotten testimonials from students, and I see that in your work, Maisie, and I think we are not hearing enough from the students, what they're experiencing, and how the tensions between the different theories are impacting them and who they are. We could add that in.
Yeah. That was my question with respect to Kylie's statement, is that if we did hear student voices, what would we do with them?
Yeah, so just kind of piggybacking off of what Chrissy shared, I think one thing for me that I often will say is that we don't necessarily need more words or more documents. like we got a whole bunch of them, what are we going to do and be different, right? And how do we really begin to center students and what they need versus whatever, our educational, our own experiences, all of that is great, but if it doesn't connect the kids, it's off or not. So how do we get more intentional about bringing kids to the table at the forefront versus at the back end, and using them as helping them to become a lever so that if they're in college or if they're at the high school, like they know how to navigate this crazy system right.
I just said they're going to be parents, and then we just have this whole cycle again, so.
I'm perhaps being repetitive, but I would just say who bears the burden of all of the things around the room? And it's typically teachers and students. And so when I read this question, what can we do? What strategic things do we need to do? We need to stop putting all of this on the backs of our teachers and telling them what they need to do. We need coaches and coordinators at the table. We need building administrators at the table. We need assistant superintendents, executive directors, and our superintendents. So if we have these layers in education, and by the way, we need our college prep programs to be at the table too, because if changes aren't happening there, I don't even know, that's another conversation. We can't just go after one group to fix the problem. That's, I think, where we come in, and we typically do.
I think we need to close before everybody comes back in and wants lunch.
Yeah, I'm going to use Amy's line, which was, there's a motivational speaker coming next, so we don't have to do that. I think, though, but exposing the reality and the discourses, I hope gets you in a place where you can argue differently and advocate differently, but also know that that we're in community and that there are people in this room that are thinking together about this. I think that's always important. I'm trying to find like the silver lining, and so that's what I'll end with. I really do appreciate your time and thinking with us and exposing these storylines and histories and legacies of and who's been excluded. And hopefully I'll see you next year or before that, but please reach out. I think we have our information here, so if you do want to keep the conversation going, Deborah and I are both really happy to do that.
I'll just say ditto, and thank you so much to all of you.